Welcome to this installment in our series of 4 conversations with archaeologist Jeremy Nienow. This series is sponsored by the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative and focuses on archaeological work undertaken in 3 of the collaborative's Minnesota counties, Dakota, Ramsey, and Scott. This work was conducted by Principal Investigator Nienow along with his firm, Nienow Cultural Consultants. My name is Barry Madore. I had the honor of hosting these conversations with Jeremy. Our first conversation was an overview of the project as a whole. The other 3 focus on the work accomplished in each specific county. Our conversations were held virtually with only our voices being recorded. So what you'll be watching is not so much a video of us talking, but more of a presentation. While we talk, you'll see photos, maps, and documents highlighting both the archaeological work itself and the historical research Nienow completed during the project, which began in 2019 and wrapped up in the spring of 2020. Before we begin, you should know that this project was funded in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund with a Heritage Partnership Program grant administered by the Minnesota Historical Society and awarded to the Dakota County Historical Society in partnership with the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative. Enjoy the presentation. I'm Barry Madore, and I'm here with Jeremy Nienow of Nienow Cultural Consultants. If you haven't seen it yet, you should go back and take a look at our overview discussion about the project, which talks about the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative itself. And today we're going to be talking about Scott County specifically. So, Jeremy, can you start us off with a quick summary of the collaborative archaeology project as a whole, then jump right into what the focus was this time around in Scott County?
Okay, so the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative this time around was looking at alpha sites, or sites that have only been recorded by individuals in the past, whether an avocational archaeologist or an historian or somebody that said, hey, there's something on a plat map, or I found some artifacts, and these could be from an archaeological site, but no archaeologist has ever looked at them. Each of the different 3 counties, Dakota, Ramsey, and Scott County, were looking at different alpha sites in different ways in each of their counties, and that's what's unique about this program. They have a template that they're working off of. They're all trying to find out more information about the past, and they're doing it in slightly different ways, but they have one archaeologist who can look at all the information across each of the 3 areas and really figure out great ways to look for archaeological sites. This is the 3rd round of grant that the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative has gotten. Their first round was really understanding more about their own historical societies, the artifacts that they already had, and what was known about the archaeology of the past in each of their counties. The second round was a literature review that was done to find out specifically what these alpha sites were like in each county. And now this 3rd round was actually going out and doing work, field work related to each of those alpha sites. Each county wanted to identify a set number of sites, usually 2 to 3 different kinds. And in Scott County, initially, we were going to look for both Native American and historic sites. And we decided, because the executive director was very new to the area and she was really starting to work on some great relationships with the Native American community, that we would focus our attention on historic sites in Scott County. And she wanted to do work in the southern portion of the county specifically because the northern portion of Scott County has been looked at much more intensely by archaeologists, primarily because of development that's gone on in the northern part of the county. So she wanted to look in the southern half of the county, and we really focused on historic sites there. So we started doing some research based on that second round of literature review that had been done, and we came across 2 paired together historic sites of New Helena and Old Helena, or Helena 1 and Helena 2, depending upon how you want to talk about them. Now, of course, I can talk about them as both being archaeological sites, 21 SC 117 and 21 SC 118. 21 is Minnesota's number in the trinomial archaeological system. SC is for Scott County, and this is the 117th and 118th recorded archaeological sites in Scott County. So every different county has its own number of archaeological sites. Some counties have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sites. Some counties, like Dodge County, has only a handful of recorded archaeological sites. Dodge County is also quite small. But these were the 117th and 118th sites. So they're paired together in a sense, and they're about 4 miles apart from each other. So I'm going to read you a little bit of history. So what we knew going into the project was based upon a history of the Minnesota Valley that was written by the Reverend Neal. and he wrote about a place called Helena. So John C. Smith settled on Section 11 in March 1855, where he built a house and a store. The next year, he had a claim laid out in town lots and named the village Helena. It's also the name of the township as well. Supposedly, Helena, Montana, or Helena, Montana, is actually named after this Helena, which is an interesting side story.
Oh, okay.
But Mr. Smith came along with a couple of individuals, Gilkey and Rickard and Barnett and Fuller. In 1856, another store was opened in the village, and there was then put in a post office there in 1856, of which J.C. Smith was the appointed postmaster. At one time, there was a lawyer and a doctor in the village, but they soon left. The village never amounted to much, and the post office was moved to a way station called Helena on the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad, about 4 miles distant. So that's what we knew going into the project. And we had a little bit of information about these 2 alpha sites from the second round of work that had been done. But essentially, that research said, hey, there's these 2 towns, Helena and Helena, and one gets settled before the other, and it gets moved because of the railroad, and there isn't a town in either of these places anymore. There's just some farmland and a couple of houses. So these could be great archaeological sites, and we think an archaeologist should go look at those. So that's where we started.
And so the township is still called Helena to this day?
It is, to this day.
And just for pronunciation purposes, so I know, for instance, that the town in Montana likes to be called Helena.
Helena,
and
right.
You know that it's Helena.
Helena.
Okay, just wanted to make sure that we're not going to get angry letters and emails.
I think it's pronounced either way. I have heard local individuals that live in both of these areas pronounce that both ways.
Okay. All right.
But that's why we oftentimes refer to things by their archaeological names, so 21SC, 117, and 118. So for both of these, we had a little bit of information going in, and the first thing that we did before doing any archaeological work or research is in October of back in 2019, pre-COVID days, we did a presentation at the Scott County Historical Society, and I explained a little bit more about what the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative was doing and our intention of going out and looking for archaeological sites. And I had a couple of places that I thought would be of interest, and I mentioned these 2 paired ghost towns together. And immediately, once the talk was done, which was only about 45 minutes long, and there was about 15 people or so in the room, people came up immediately, and one of the people said, oh, I know all about that town. I know people who live in where it used to be, and we'll give you some contact information. And they introduced us to the Francises, Mr. and Mrs. Francis, and we drove right out there. Not that very day, but we made contact with them. We went down to visit. So I did this in each of the counties. The very first thing is after we did a little initial round of research, we contacted landowners. We wanted to find places that had the fewest number of landowners owning potentially where the archaeological sites were, because it's just easier. You know, if you have 3 landowners you got to contact, it's much harder than 1 landowner. But in every situation, I know I've said this time and time again throughout these interviews, the landowners in every situation were more than willing. They were fascinated. They were highly interested in the work. And they all came out and helped us when we did the archaeological work. They were interested in coming to presentations and finding out more. And they gave us lots of extra help and insight. At Helena 1, the landowner's name is Eldon, and he came out every day on his 4-wheeler. And he's an interested avocationalist, a guy who grew up in Illinois. And then the Francis family, we went out and talked with them. And I have a funny little aside. So we figured out where their house was at, and we drove down there. And it was a pretty warm day in October, I remember. And I'm not a huge fan of dogs. I'll just be really honest. I don't like dogs.
Okay.
And I like cats. I got a lot of cats. But
I would have pegged you the other way, but you know.
I know. I'm not a dog guy. Not a dog guy. So we drove down this little valley right by the creek that's there, and Sand Creek, and we pull in. We notice this long, winding mill pond that's right there, and we're immediately like, there's something historic and cool going on here. The house is clearly built up in sort of the middle of this and looks more like it's relatively recent, i.e. it's in the last 100 years of construction. And they were doing some highway construction about a half a mile away from their property. And we always have high-vis vests on, and things like that, because we're not trying to sneak up on anybody, and we like to, so we knock on the door, and the lady says, "Oh, come on in," normally they stop you at the door and say, what do you want? What's going on? Who are you? And usually allowed to give a short spiel about who you are. But she's like, oh, come in. So we came in and she's like, yeah, we've been having the problem with the internet all day. And if you can get that fixed, I'd really appreciate it. And I said, no, ma'am, we're not here about the internet. We're here about archaeology. And she's like, tell me more about this. So Mrs. Francis, we explained to her that we had been looking for what we thought was this town called Helena or New Helena or the railroad depot of Helena. And she's like, I know all about that. And, we're the fourth or fifth group of individuals that have purchased this land since it was Helena. And I happen to have a couple of recordings that were done back in the 1980s, back in 1985, by a then landowner named Florian Carl, who was born in 1897. And he did some oral history stuff with the guy over 2 cassette tapes. And she gave us those. She gave us some plat maps. I mean, extremely helpful. Really helpful. So we did that work in October for Helena 2, or New Helena. Sometimes I call them lots of different things, but Helena 2, that's how we were keeping them separate for a while there, because it can get, when you're talking to people and you're talking about Helena and they're like, oh, it's this. And I'm like, no, not that Helena, this other Helena. So it gets confusing. So that was at Helena 2. For Helena 1, or the original, or old Helena, we did the same thing. We went out to the house. We could see that there was this interesting woodlot that it cut through, and we knocked on the individual's door, and she's like, oh, you want to talk to Eldon about that stuff? And so we talked to Eldon, and in both cases, again, we were looking at historic sites. We weren't looking for Native American sites at the time. And Eldon came out and he said, I grew up walking fields and things in Illinois, and I've found a lot of arrowheads and things when I was a kid. And we do a lot of gardening on our plot, and I found this particular arrowhead over in the area where you think this ghost town used to be. So he pulls out this projectile point. It's not an arrowhead. It's actually from an atlatl or a larger, like a spear-like type of a dart. And it's extremely old. Here's a picture of it here that you can be looking at. That's called a Scott's Bluff projectile point, and these are from the end of the Paleo period into the early Archaic. They're thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. Some of the earliest evidence of peoples in this part of Minnesota. This is what this projectile point belongs to. And the material that it's made out of is not a local material at all, and it speaks to this large migrational nomadic lifestyle that people had during that time period, where they traveled all around getting the best resources and living off the land. So that was a great connection. Right away we were looking for the ghost town, and we found a Native American connection immediately to landscape, because it turns out, and I know this is a shocker to a lot of people, but places where you and I love to live, people have always loved to live. And we love water, we like high places, we like being able to see around us, we like getting access to resources. And yes, maybe our resources have changed. We can go to the gas station, the grocery, things like that. But access to water and easy transportation routes are the same things that people thousands of years ago were also looking for. So
Makes sense.
Archaeological sites tend to be in the same places where people are living today. So he showed us those, but then he also took us on a brief walk, and we went out, and immediately we found the remnants of a very old log cabin and a few other things that I'll talk about here now in specific.
Sounds like you hit pay dirt right away.
Yeah. So for both places in Scott County, we thought we were going to get limited on what we could do. And it turned out to be this huge, wonderful opportunity of these two paired together community towns that unfortunately now are both ghost towns, but who had their own interesting lives in the past, with the original Helena being from the 1855 until the 1880s. And then New Helena taking over in the late 1870s, early 1880s until 1904. And today, you would drive past both places and you wouldn't know that they ever existed, unfortunately, because those vestiges of the past are all below ground now, and they're the domain of the archaeologist.
Wow.
Yeah. Kind of interesting stuff. It's like a whole reason I do archaeology right there. So we'll talk a little bit about Helena, the first community of Helena.
So Old Helena.
Old Helena, 21 SC 117. Again, we knew a little bit about it from the history that was written by the Reverend Neal back in 1882 in the history of the Minnesota Valley. And so right there we know, okay, if he's writing this in 1882 and he says that there's, the post office has been moved to someplace else and nothing's really much of the town, then we know and by 1882 the post office is already gone and there's probably not much of a community left. However, what archaeologists have learned is that we can never take one person's word for anything. And we need to look at multiple sources of information in the past. Oftentimes, that's a past that we dig up and then we interpret based on cultural material without the use of historic documents at all. But when available, we tend to look at as many things as we can. So one of the first things we look at are the first recorded maps for the area. All those are oftentimes GLO or Government Land Office maps, which then lead to the earliest plat maps, which are recordations of who owns what on the landscape. And then after that, you have atlases for each of the counties or directories, farmers' directories. We look at those. And then as we get closer to us in time, one of the most wonderful things we find, beginning in the late 1920s and early 1930s, we see aerial photography stretching over much of Minnesota, which continues to today. And now, of course, we have satellite imagery and LIDAR and all kinds of other advanced ways to look at the landscape. So in looking at the historic plats, even though the Reverend Neal says that, by 1882, few signs of the former site remain and everything is gone, when we look at the 1898 plat map, we look at the Atlas and Farmers Directory of Scott County in 1913. Even when we look at the 1944 plat map, we still see vestiges of old Helena being there.
In 1944?
Even in 1944. By the time we look at those 1930s aerial photographs, though, we really don't see anything from the above ground. So really, people are carrying over plat book information. Interestingly enough, communities were platted. What you would do is you'd buy a large section of land, you'd go down to the county recorder's office, wherever that would be, and you would pay to have somebody plat out of town for you, which usually means you put it into blocks, you'd name a series of streets. We weren't very original, so oftentimes they're either named after what we thought was going to be going on there, or then at First, Second, and Third Street. But you'd have Main Street and Mill Street, right, and things like that. Lakeview, and very common, of course, the most common name. I'm sure, Barry, you know this because you like to go to Caribou Coffee, and there's trivia questions all the time. But what's the most common street name in the United States?
Boy, you pegged me wrong about the Caribou, so I must have missed that question.
Let's do this. It's Washington.
Seriously, no, you would have gotten about 23 guesses from me before I went ahead on that.
Right, yeah, Washington's a popular guy. But now, of course, what happens in the modern setting, beginning really in the 1950s and moving forward, is we've changed everything to First Street and Avenue, and you have to get out into the suburbs in modern planning before you see all kinds of really cool names for places. So based on all of those, we know a little bit more about the community. And then we started doing some research. And since we had the winter, because remember this was in October, and we didn't do any archaeological work at all at New Helena in the fall. It just didn't work out to get over there in time. We had a very short fall season. And then, of course, in the spring, COVID hit, so that changed how we did archaeology. So although we did some public archaeology at the original Helena site, our archaeology work that we did at New Helena was only with team members and not with members of the public, and we had to follow COVID protocols. So after we did a little bit of archaeological research and we went and talked with Eldon, and then we went back into a little bit more research, we had a pretty good understanding that with the fields and things that were there, we had expected to find some remnants of the early buildings, and we wanted to document those buildings to the best of our ability using a couple different techniques. We're actually going to walk a couple of fields because parts of the village are now a cornfield. And we wanted to do some shovel testing in a big wooded lot. And we wanted to use some cameras and things to take pictures and get some GIS information on some of the abandoned foundations, natural stone foundations, and log cabin stuff that were there. So that's what we tried to do in the fall for Old Helena. So we found an 1898 plat of Helena from the Northwest Publishing Plat Book that showed at that time, even though the post office had already been moved, we don't exactly know when it got moved, but we do know that it's before 1880. At that time, there was still a blacksmith shop, and there was also a house right across from that blacksmith shop. So those were the two things that were there. There was also a school that was platted, school number 33, that was just south of the town. And then there were a couple of surrounding village houses and things that weren't platted in the community itself. So even though there was a huge number of blocks that John Smith originally platted in 1855, by the 1890s, there's only two blocks, Block 1 and Block 2, that have anything on them. And they have some great names. There's River Street, Walnut Street, Vine, Lake, and Ash Streets. So for the blocks, and there's an alley in each of the blocks in Section 11 of Helena Township. So we wanted to look for that blacksmith shop. We wanted to look for the house that was just across Lake Street from it, which now is all plowed fields. That entire block 1 is a plowed field. Block 2 is in a woodland and has Eldon's driveway cutting diagonally right through it. So we went out to do our research in that first in the fall, and we had members of the public with us both times, including Eldon, the landowner. We immediately saw that the wood lot, unfortunately, was very dense. I mean, very dense. You could not walk through that. We wanted to do shovel testing to look for the blacksmith shop, and we were not able to do that because it was just impossible. It was impassable, intraversable. Couldn't get in there. So we were not able to do that, but we did shovel tests immediately where Walnut Street would be, just north of Block 2, when that was also the relative location of where Eldon had found that Scotts Bluff projectile point. So we walked some gardens that were up that way. We did some shovel tests. We did find another piece of Native American chipping debris from making a stone tool, which was really cool. But when we were walking the farm field where Block 1 would be, immediately we found artifacts where that house would have been on lot number 6 of Block 1. So we found some cool things in the fall. We knew we were in a good place. We went over the winter. We specifically did more research based on the oral history that had been done in the 1980s, and then going back and doing some looking through the history books and looking at some great secondary sources that have been written by people like post offices in Minnesota and things like that. There's some great research out there. So we did a bunch of that, and we came back in April and did an additional walkover of that same farm field area and found even more materials. And so I'll talk about those in just a little bit. But we were able to document the post office that was originally there from 1858 until about 1870, and Schoolhouse number 33, which is immediately just south of Helena, the rough-hewn log cabin that was also there. We documented all of those, and you can see these great pictures of the what's still left of that log cabin. We have a little bit more of information from the oral history about family individuals that live there. We went did some work on Ancestry.com and found out more information about them, which was really great.
So you have a schoolhouse, you have a post office. How populous of an area? Are we just talking specifically to serve the people that lived in the platted area, or were these built prospectively, hoping that there would be enough people for these services to be available? What are we talking about in terms of numbers of people?
Schoolhouses are placed in township areas. They will basically one section of land out of a whole series of sections will be given over for placement of a school, and any sale of any of the land around that goes to fund that school.
Oh, okay.
That's how we did the rural schoolhouse thing. So that schoolhouse would have served the immediate populational area, but really this community, it's a chicken and an egg situation, right? You got to have something in the area for people to be drawn to settle, and then once people start settling, you have to have something where they can get goods and services at. So for most early community settlement in really south central through southeastern Minnesota, prior to railroad, because the railroads don't get here until the late 1870s and early 1880s, and we don't get to the border with North Dakota until 1878. And really, all of North Dakota settlement is based upon where the railroads went. Wherever the railroads went, that's where people put up their communities. But in Minnesota, we're here prior to the placement of railroads. So individuals usually started with some kind of a business, usually a store. And near that is usually some kind of industry, like a mill, either a sawmill or a grist mill for doing flour, or both. And then if you happen to get a couple other things combined together with that, some different institutions, if you will, you have some economic institutions going on. But if you happen to get some governmental institutions or educational institutions, schools, post offices, maybe you get lucky and you happen to be the county seat that gets settled, those institutions cascade upon each other to create a minimum number for success. And that institutional diversity is key for any community to succeed. Communities that end up being mono-institutional, like maybe they're just driven by economics, when those economics change, those communities die.
Right.
So we think of classic boom towns, whether they're gold towns or lumber towns. When those resources are depleted, the people leave because they're only really there for one reason. But if you are able to keep a diversity of institutions functioning in your community can survive. So when Helena starts to struggle a little bit, and ultimately the railroad is put in to the west of this community, and then the post office gets moved to the depot into the store that gets put for the railroad, that essentially that loss of an institution really is the death knell for that community. And people will then, when they're settling, they will refocus over to New Helena versus Old Helena.
Okay.
Yeah, this idea of institutional diversity is a pretty interesting one in anthropological circles, and I happen to have written my entire dissertation about it.
Ha-ha.
Surprise! So
Conversation for another
day. So for the artifacts themselves for original Helena, we did find only a very small handful, 3 Native American objects. One, of course, being that Scotts Bluff projectile point, which the landowner already had. We only found 2 other small pieces of chipping debris. So there is a Native American presence in this area, and it's right off of a small valley with a stream that cuts through it. So it's a great research spot. It makes complete sense. But really the historic materials, and we found a lot more of those. Even though with prehistoric materials, we only found 3 of them, 2 pieces of lithic debris and 1 projectile point, we found between the 2 seasons of doing field work out there and walking in that field where that depression, there's a very slight depression, but where the house was across from the blacksmith's shop, we found 173 artifacts that we kept.
Oh, wow.
So quite a bit. And we walked very close interval the first time around because it was pre-COVID, and we walked at much wider intervals in the post-COVID world. So that changed our methodology for survey. We found 173 artifacts. A lot of them are ceramic in nature, and we've specifically selected those kinds of materials because they are very easy to date, and they can give us a really tight range of when this community should have been there. So we know that the community gets started in the 1850s, 1855, and we know it's there at least until the 1880s, even after the post office leaves, and it keeps getting put on maps. So of those 173 artifacts, we found a whole series, dozens of different ceramics, and they tell us a lot of different things. So for example, we found 2 buttons that are typical of the mid-1800s. We found some pieces of unscalped blue shell-edged whiteware that gets started in 1841 and ends by 1854. So that's from the 1840s. So that's somebody brought that with them when they settled in 1855. We found a portion of a rectangular ink bottle, a boat ink bottle, that dates to 1890. We also found a couple different pieces of pipe stems, so no people are out there smoking. We have a red clay effigy pipe bowl, not a Native American effigy pipe, but a historic effigy pipe that's from 1840 to 1870. And we also found whiteware sherds that had transfer print on them, which dated to both 1816 to 1836, and then later on in post-1828. So we found a good amount of materials archaeologically that say, hey, this structure, it overlaps right into 1850, 1860 when we combine together all the dates for those objects, and it goes until about 1880. So that fits perfectly from where we thought, when we thought this community was from. So between all of that work, we were able to not only nail down, so to speak, where exactly Helena 1 or Old Helena or the original community of Helena was, but we're able to document and use the oral tradition information that we found and then our archaeological record to document at least where one of the structures were. And then we were able to do more work with the log cabin and things that were on the property and start to tie together and connect this story of people who lived in the area by pulling together all these different types of resources. And the archaeology really did confirm for us exactly the right time period of when this community was around. So that's the story of Old Helena, which again, nowadays is an archaeological site. It's 21 SC 117.
Great.
So really, New Helena, which is the second story. So if we're reading along with Reverend Neal, and he talks about Helena, John C. Smith settling originally at Helena in March of 1855. In 1856, they start a store, and J.C. Smith succeeds in having a post office established there, of which he was appointed the postmaster. At one time, there was a lawyer and a doctor, but they soon left. The village never amounted to much, and then the last line leads us to the next part of the story. And the post office was moved to a way station called Helena on the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad, about 4 miles distance. So that picks us up to the second part of our story for New Helena, or Helena 2, or archaeological site 21 SC 118. So New Helena gets going specifically because of the railroads. By the late 1870s and early 1880s, railroads are being crisscrossed across the upper Midwest, and railroads do become the primary way for settlement. Oftentimes, people that had already settled in the area, they begged and they bribed and they did whatever they had to do to get their railroad to come to their community. And if the railroad didn't come to your community, it was pretty much the end of your community unless you had a lot of other things going for you. So if you survived that first round and you didn't get the railroad, then you might get a railroad spur that eventually got to your community until eventually all communities are connected eventually by railroad. But railroads really did set the bar for where to settle after that. So this story of the move from Old Helena to New Helena is really a story that is repeated time and time again on the Minnesota frontier as communities initially survived and thrived and then died once the railroad came through. So people always talk about the railroad being a town killer, and it really was in a lot of ways. You had to have something cool and unique going on for you, or as I like to think about it, you had to have a lot of other institutional support happening for your community to survive that first round. So there's lots of great historic stories in southeastern Minnesota, places even like there is well known as like historic Forestville, which is one of the historic sites that the Minnesota Historical Society operates to this day. That's a company town that gets set up, and it has all kinds of different industrial things going on in a store and a scale house, and it serves all the local community. And then the railroad goes through to another location, and it basically is the end of the community. They survive for a period of time afterwards, but they never, ever amount to anything, unfortunately. And nowadays it's an historic site, which is kind of cool in and of itself, but not for the people that tried to build a community there. So New Helena gets set up, and some of the things that were important for it is it has that railroad connection.
Right.
So its earliest thing is the railroad. Then they set up a store there with the depot, and after that, they put in a mill, and that's a pretty big thing. So the mill served as both a grist mill and a sawmill. And so for grist milling, they were producing feed, rye, buckwheat, flour. And then for sawing, they were also doing all kinds of local woods, oak, maple, cottonwood, basswood. As we learned in the oral histories, whatever was growing, they were milling. Initially, it's clear from the archaeological evidence and basically looking at the landscape that the mill operated with some sort of a water wheel. There was a large mill pond that was set up to have the mill going. But even by the time of Carl's memory in the early 1900s, it's a steam engine, a steam-driven mill by that point.
This is an old gentleman by the name of Florian Carl. He used to live here, down the road here.
Oh.
And I'm getting some history from him.
Oh.
I'm taping some of his comments.
We used to go into that mill, after it didn't go anymore.
Was the mill still standing with the wheel, the water wheel?
No, no water wheel. Oh. It was a steam engine that done the milling. I never heard of anybody that knew when the water mill was going, but it must have been at one time, because that pond is always called the mill pond.
I understand they filled in the mill race when they built that road. And
that could be.
The mill wheel is supposed to be covered up there somewhere.
Oh, is that right?
Well, that's what I heard, yeah.
Well, at that time, maybe, yeah. But I know their last steam engine that they took out of there, the foundry, they took that. See, they ground flour with a steam engine for quite a long time. And then they got a great big gasoline engine and ground flour and sawed lumber with that.
And then the community continues to develop, and they get a creamery, and which is a really big deal, and it gets mentioned in a lot of the local papers. Jordan is one of the nearest communities between, I think it's Belle Prairie or Belle Plaine and Jordan. They eventually suck away all the people, and that's why the Helena doesn't exist. And really after World War I, Helena is really no more. But the mill continues to operate at least until the 1930s, because we can still see it on aerial photographs in the late 1830s. And this individual, Carl, knows quite a bit about it still from his memories. So they have a creamery and a mill and the railroad depot that goes through and a post office. But the post office is gone by 1904.
This is the post office that was moved from the original Helena?
Yeah, from the original one, yep. So they had the original one, and then it was moved. So the post office, which originally starts at Helena and gets set up in 1858, right, and is there until the depot gets set up. We know from plats that the railroad appears on the 1880 plat, and we know that Reverend Neal says by 1882 the post office isn't there, so we know by late 1870s, early 1880, the post office has been moved, and the post office ceases to be in 1904. According to a great book, which I highly recommend everybody reads, called Post Offices of Minnesota. It's written by Patera and Gallagher. It's in 1978. You really can't get it nowadays. You can find old printings of it, but it's a wonderful volume that talks about all the early post offices in Minnesota. So that post office getting moved from Helena to Helena means that it still stayed Helena. They just push the name. So old Helena ceases to be, and new Helena gets moved 4 miles away, and it's like an institutional miracle. But all that is you take the box where the mail arrives, and the store owner would sort it by the people that live in the community, and they would just have it sorted for them. And then you'd come to the store, which again is great. You're going to go to the store, which means you might buy something else. That's why gas stations exist, right? You don't make any money on gas in a gas station. You make it from the stuff in the little convenience store. So post offices do the same thing. If you have a little community store, you put the post office in it. People have to come there to get their mail. So they get sought after by store owners really early on. So Helena literally does some magic and moves 4 miles, all because the post office moves. And
do we know anything about the people? Did the people also move? Is there...
Yes and no. This is a complicated question, but a group of people don't move at all. Some people move, but those people continue to move, and that's why these ghost towns become ghost towns, is because, at the end of the day, the reason a town fails is because nobody lives there. Right? It's the people. People make towns. So Helena got its start. It had a small community. The railroad came in. It shifted where the entry and exit point was for getting on the railroad to this depot 4 miles away. They then saw an opportunity. Old Helena didn't seem to be doing as well as they thought it was going to do. Moving to the railroad didn't seem to make a good sense. So they moved the post office one to another, essentially moving the community. And people, had to make a decision at that point. But it was good for the people that were already living where New Helena gets established, and it's not good for the people at Old Helena. But the people that have Old Helena, if you were already a landowner, chances are you stayed. And the reason we know that is because by 1898, the houses and buildings and things are still there, and they survive well into the 1940s. Same thing with New Helena. Even though New Helena gets established and gets bigger and has a creamery and a mill and other things going on, those are new names. So those are new people that are living in those communities. And then after World War I, the post office is already dissolved or moved away in 1904. And then after World War I, New Helena really doesn't exist anymore either. People, when they come back after the war, they settle in the larger nearby communities. And so both of these end up, sadly, as ghost towns. So we know that there was a general store and a set of creameries and a mill. In ghost towns, the closer that ghost town gets to us in time, the more landowners are going to be there today. So in early ghost towns, if they fail early enough, chances are there's only 1 or 2 people that own the land for the whole entire community nowadays, right? Because if a community is successful for a period of time, lots get divided and sold, and more people own that land. And unless it's in a farm field and gets consolidated, in New Helena, there end up being about a dozen different landowners in the area. And the Francis family that we hooked up with happens to be one that controls or owns where the mill was at and where the store was at, and is across from where the railroad line is at. We knew where the creameries were on the other side of the railroad tracks, just to the north and east of where the depot was. So we reached out to those landowners, and they weren't really interested. So we focused on the store and on the mill. And unfortunately, there's a tragic event that happens for the store. The store itself stops being a store in the relatively recent history. So in the mid 1900s, nobody is being there as a store, and it's basically just someone's house. And that stays that way into the 1980s, when there's a tragic fire that blows up the stove and actually kills the mom and burns down the house. So
terrible story.
It's a really bad story. We know it from the oral history and from people talking in the community, but we couldn't actually find the newspaper story about it. But we know it has to happen, because when you look at it now, there's nothing there. There's nothing that remains above ground. We know the mill is also, shows up in the earliest sets of aerial photography, but then later on it's also torn down, and there's no above ground evidence of that either in the landscape. So we went out in the spring of 2020 in the COVID era, and we had a lot of social distancing going on. We're all wearing masks. We're all wearing gloves. You have your own equipment. You're not sharing equipment or anything like that. And we put in a series of shovel tests across where these structures should have been based on the maps. And we found, we basically have very little archaeology, a whole bunch of archaeology, and then a little bit, and then a whole bunch more. So we were able to sort of play positive, negative with these and locate where they're at. And for both cases, we found, for the store, found evidence of nails and glass and window glass and basically the hardware and things that you'd expect, like door hinges and pieces of piping and tubing, also plastics, things that we knew were pushing into the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, because we don't have plastic before the 1950s. Things like that, along with crockery and whiteware. So we know that it had been a long-established house, at least from the early 1900s, if not the late 1800s, and then it went out at least up until the 1960s and 70s. So we know, again, archaeology is telling us the same story that we hear from people telling us oral history, and then we could probably figure out from newspapers. And we had round nails and square nails in both of those. So that tells us an interesting story, too, because square nails are a different form of manufacture. They're also called cut nails. So they're basically a sheet of metal that is stamped or cut to make these square nails. Before those, obviously, are wrought nails, hand-wrought nails that blacksmiths are making. Later on, we have round nails, more commonly known as wire nails. They're basically wire that's drawn out and clipped to make nails. And we see that transition in Minnesota just about 1880.
Okay.
So if you see a combination of both of those, you're looking at something around 1880, 1890 for the something getting built, and then of course lots of modern galvanized nails and things on the landscape too. So that was really interesting for the house itself. For the mill, we as archaeologists, there's 40% of my job that is experience and the ability to predict on the landscape where you're going to find something based upon how long you've been doing archaeology, the amount of research you've done, so you can be confident about where things should be. And the other 60% of the job sometimes is luck. We know something could be there. We're only digging a hole that's about a foot across. So if you're in a landscape that's hundreds of feet long, and you're only digging a hole every 50 feet that's 1 foot in size, you're shooting darts at a dartboard, to get lucky on something. Right. So we try to read the landscape the best we can. And so we put in a series of shovel tests. And in one of the shovel tests, as you see here in this picture, we hit a dressed piece of granite, big block of granite that's been dressed down to be used for a building. And you and I both know, right? If you're building a normal residence or a structure, you might get brick. You're certainly going to get a lot of wood and things like that. You're not going to get a huge granite block, right? What do we need? What do we need giant blocks of granite and things for? Well, nowadays we think of large buildings, your courthouse buildings, your big post offices nowadays. Maybe it's the Capitol building.
Right.
If you're building in the early 1900s and you're building with large granite block, you're doing that because you're trying to build something that's very stable, very sturdy, that can have large pieces of machinery in it and it's not going to fall down. I.e., we found the mill with one shovel test.
Perfect.
So although we didn't find a lot of artifacts in that exact same unit, that dressed mill block piece is perfect for finding a large structure. Yes, we got lucky to a certain extent. We also knew we were in the right spot.
Right.
So although a number of artifacts is smaller, we have compelling evidence from both sites as to where structures used to be so that we could give them both site names. And I really hope, yes, Helena 1 is cool, and it's the earlier of the two, and we've got potential there to look for the blacksmith shop and a few other things. Helena 2, the new Helena, has this mill, and mill excavations are really cool. I would love to go back, and I really hope that Scott County considers doing additional large-scale units. So we're talking like a 6-foot by 3-foot rectangle that we put in the ground, where we dig a larger area out and look and see more information about how this mill was constructed. We know from records what kinds of materials that they're doing, both grist mill and lumber mill. So maybe we can find some of those
in the same facility.
In the same facility, yep. Different seasons, switch out your equipment. You have different kinds of saws and grinding and stuff going on. So, yeah, we would really like to go back and do additional research for both of these places. Not so much research, but actual archaeology. And we would love to focus on Helena too, the newer of the two places, because we have this great opportunity with this mill to do work, and it's it's a really exciting place. So they're both cool. In all of the work that we did in Dakota, Ramsey, and Scott, they each in their own way had interesting archaeology that came out of them. But for Scott County, starting out by going, we're not going to look at prehistoric Native American sites. We're only going to look at Euro-American. We're only going to look in the southern half of the county. We kind of feel like we were hamstringing ourselves in some ways. We really found this amazing opportunity to find this paired twin story of these two communities that both became ghost towns. And archaeology, in combination with us doing a lot of additional historical research, gave us a tremendously interesting story.
That's fantastic. Is the Historic Society going to be continuing the story of these two towns or presenting it in some way?
I hope that they do. So all the artifacts from Scott County Historical Society is not a qualified repository for archaeological materials. So all these materials are being curated with the Minnesota Historical Society.
Okay.
But I also would hope that Scott County would continue to build its relationship with its living Native peoples to this day.
Right.
The Shakopee community that's there, they have their own cultural center that's been built and is wonderful. And I hope we continue to build relationships with them so that we can actually go out and do not only early historic archaeology of Euro-Americans, which is interesting in its own right, but learning more about who the peoples that have been living here for the thousands of years prior to Euro-Americans coming in, and really seeing those connections, like when the landowner had the Scott's Bluff Point, and
right.
realizing that, yes, it's really cool that this community was here in the 1850s, but this Scott's Bluff Point is from 8,000 years ago. That's a tremendous time depth and appreciation for peoples in the past that archaeologists are constantly trying to get people to remember. We oftentimes have very short memories, especially as Euro-Americans, and we think that history in the Midwest began in the 1850s and maybe the 1840s, or even with the first earliest building in 1820 at Fort Snelling being constructed, the oldest structure in Minnesota at 1820. Native peoples have been living in the landscape for thousands of years prior to Euro-American settlement here, and we need to remember, appreciate, and honor that historic and living history that we have.
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful place to leave this conversation. Thanks, Jeremy.
My pleasure.
And thank you all for joining us for this conversation with Jeremy L. Nienow about the archaeological work Nienow Cultural Consultants did in partnership with the Metro Area Historical Society Collaborative. You can find the video presentations of our conversations covering the archaeological work done in each of the Collaborative's 3 counties, and one focusing on the overall project, on the websites for each historical society. We hope you take a chance to view them all and participate the next time there's a public archaeology project in your area.